They were the final word in justice, the robed figures who decided freedom or imprisonment, innocence or guilt. We trusted them to be impartial, incorruptible, blind to everything except the law. But behind the bench, in chambers hidden from public view, some of them made a different choice. They sold their verdicts. They traded lives for profit. They became the very criminals they were sworn to judge. These are 10 true stories of judges who betrayed justice itself, and how the system finally turned against them. Number 1. Judge Raymond Kessler. The price of the gavel, he was the picture of dignity each morning when he entered his courtroom. The black robe, the firm stride, the quiet authority that commanded every corner of the chamber. To the public, Judge Raymond Kessler represented everything the law was meant to be: fairness, order, and restraint. For nearly 2 decades, he presided over cases in the state of Pennsylvania, earning a reputation for his sharp mind and steady hand. But behind the composed face of justice was a man slowly undone by greed. In the spring of 2012, whispers began to circle around Kessler Courthouse. Defense attorneys who had once waited weeks for rulings now seemed to receive favorable decisions almost overnight. Prosecutors noticed small irregularities, sentences that seemed strangely lenient, especially for defendants represented by a handful of the same lawyers. It was coincidence, they thought, until it wasn't. A young clerk, new to the court, noticed something peculiar. Each week, after certain trials, Kessler's chambers would be closed for several hours. Visitors would come and go, sometimes in plain suits, sometimes carrying thick folders or discreet envelopes. The clerk's curiosity grew into suspicion when she realized those visits almost always coincided with controversial rulings. It began, as corruption often does, with justification. Kessler had told himself that after years of public service, a few gifts from well-connected attorneys weren't truly wrong, just tokens of appreciation for his efficiency. But as the favors grew, so did his appetite. What started as an expensive bottle of wine or a weekend trip soon turned into cash payments, wired quietly through intermediaries, always routed through his brother-in-law's small business. The first break came not from the courtroom, but from the bank. An investigator with the state's anti-money laundering task force flagged a pattern of unusual deposits, small enough to evade scrutiny, but frequent enough to raise eyebrows. The deposits matched dates of high-profile verdicts Kessler had delivered in the previous year. When state authorities moved in, they didn't confront him right away. They watched. For 3 months, agents traced his movements, monitored communications, and documented transactions. The evidence built slowly but decisively. Then one morning, as Kessler entered the courthouse, he was met not by attorneys, but by officers from the Attorney General's office. Inside his office, the air turned heavy. Stacks of documents, crisp bills still bound with paper bands, and handwritten notes from attorneys thanking him for his discretion. Kessler's hands trembled as he sat behind the same desk where he had once pronounced others guilty. The investigation revealed a scheme stretching back nearly 5 years. In exchange for reduced sentences, favorable rulings, or dismissed evidence, Kessler had accepted more than $400,000 in bribes. Some payments had been disguised as campaign contributions. Others were thinly veiled consulting fees paid to relatives. The most damning evidence was his own handwriting, a private ledger hidden in his desk drawer, where each transaction was carefully recorded. When the scandal broke, Pennsylvania's legal community recoiled. Lawyers who had built their careers arguing before Kessler suddenly found themselves subpoenaed. Several claimed coercion, others admitted complicity. The courthouse where he once commanded silence now echoed with reporters shouting questions and the dull click of cameras. Kessler's trial became a national spectacle, the irony too sharp to ignore. The judge who had once lectured defendants about moral decay now stood in their place. Prosecutors methodically presented the case, bank records, emails, and testimony from attorneys who had once called him Your Honor. The defense tried to frame him as a victim of burnout, a man crushed by years of service and tempted by easy money. But the evidence left little room for sympathy. Midway through the proceedings, a former prosecutor took the stand. Her voice was calm, but heavy with disappointment. "We all trusted him," she said. "We believed justice meant something here. But every verdict, every sentence he gave, now feels poisoned." The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict: guilty on all counts, bribery, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The sentence: 17 years in federal prison. When Kessler removed his robe for the last time, there was no ceremony, no dignity. Only the sound of chains as officers led him away. The gavel that had once symbolized authority was now just a reminder of his downfall. Inside prison, he worked quietly in the law library, helping inmates draft appeals, the same process he once ruled over with absolute control. Reporters who visited said he seemed older, hollowed out, a man crushed beneath the weight of his own hypocrisy. For the people of Pennsylvania, the case left scars that ran deeper than one man's corruption. Every defendant who had stood in his courtroom now questioned whether justice had ever truly been served. Every verdict he rendered came under review, hundreds of cases re-examined. In the end, Raymond Kessler's story became a study in irony, a reminder that even those entrusted with judgment are not immune to the lure of power and greed. His name was stripped from courthouse plaques, his awards rescinded, his career erased. Justice, once his weapon, had become his sentence. Number 2. Judge Martha Delacroix, Shadows in the Courtroom. In a quiet corner of Louisiana, Judge Martha Delacroix had built her name on the illusion of virtue. She spoke of law as if it were sacred scripture, lectured young attorneys on ethics, and presided over every case with a calm, motherly authority that earned her respect across the state. Her courtroom was known for its decorum, her rulings for their decisiveness. To the people of Orleans Parish, she was the model of judicial grace. But as the years passed, a shadow grew beneath that grace, one born of vanity, greed, and the slow intoxication of unchecked power. The first cracks appeared in 2016 when whispers began circulating among local defense attorneys. Rumors that cases assigned to Delacroix's docket could be guided, that outcomes could be managed, not through skillful argument, but through quiet payment. At first, no one believed it. She had been on the bench for more than a decade, honored by bar associations and featured in local magazines as a pillar of community justice. Then came the case of State versus Giroux, a mid-level narcotics trafficker whose conviction seemed certain. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance, confessions, and a mountain of seized drugs. Yet, against all expectations, the charges were reduced, the sentence suspended, and the defendant walked free. The district attorney's office was baffled. One prosecutor, who had spent months preparing the case, noticed something unsettling. Giroux's defense attorney, a man named Vincent Carden, had an unusually close relationship with the judge. He was seen dining with her at the same small restaurant several times that month. It could have been coincidence, until investigators discovered that Carden's law firm had recently made a donation to a local children's literacy fund, one administered directly by Delacroix's husband. At first, the payment seemed legitimate. The fund had been created years earlier to provide books for underprivileged schools. But when auditors examined the transactions, they found something curious: large withdrawals labeled expenses that led to a private account held under the judge's maiden name. What followed was one of the most delicate investigations in Louisiana's judicial history. State investigators moved cautiously, fearing leaks or political blowback. For 6 months, they built their case in silence, reviewing rulings, tracing money trails, and quietly interviewing court staff. One clerk described moments that haunted her memory: sealed envelopes delivered after hours, quick meetings behind chambers, and the faint smell of perfume mingling with the rustle of paper money. When agents finally confronted Judge Delacroix, she sat in her chambers surrounded by law books and plaques honoring her commitment to justice. At first, she denied everything. Then, faced with forensic evidence of bank transfers and recorded conversations with attorney Carden, the calm mask shattered. The scheme was both elegant and audacious. Over 5 years, she had orchestrated a network of payoffs disguised as charitable donations. Defense attorneys seeking leniency or acquittal could contribute to her husband's fund, knowing a portion would find its way to her. The bribes totaled nearly $600,000. In exchange, sentences were softened, fines reduced, and in some cases, charges dismissed altogether. When the story broke, it shook Louisiana's legal community to its core. Every verdict she had rendered, hundreds of them, came under review. The courthouse where she once commanded silence now echoed with outrage. Protesters gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice is not for sale." The trial was swift but humiliating. The prosecution laid out evidence with surgical precision: financial ledgers, intercepted messages, and testimony from attorneys who confessed their roles in exchange for leniency. The defense argued that Delacroix had been manipulated by her husband, claiming he had overseen the fund's finances and convinced her of its legality. But the evidence told a different story. Handwritten notes in her own script approving donations from certain lawyers, her signature on transfers to private accounts. Midway through her trial, one of her former students from law school spoke during the proceedings. He recalled her lectures about the moral spine of justice. When asked what he thought now, his voice trembled. "She taught us that no one is above the law," he said. But she forgot her own lesson. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts, bribery, fraud, and money laundering. Her sentence: 22 years in federal prison. When she was led out of the courtroom, her head was bowed, her hands shaking. Cameras captured the fall of a woman who once embodied judicial perfection. The courthouse staff wept, not for her innocence, but for what she had stolen from them: faith in the system. In prison, Delacroix became a legal tutor for other inmates, teaching the very laws she had once twisted. She refused interviews, her only statement a brief line to the press: "I let ambition blind me to the truth." The Children's Literacy Fund was dissolved, and its remaining money redirected to real charities. The courthouse where she presided was renovated, her portrait quietly removed from the main hallway. Yet her story lingers in the minds of those who still walk its halls, a reminder that corruption does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from behind the bench. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to The Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Number 3. Judge Leonard Vance. Verdicts for sale? In the heart of Chicago's legal district, the marble halls of the federal courthouse once echoed with confidence. Lawyers in tailored suits, clerks clutching case files, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with old wood polish. But by the summer of 2018, those same halls were thick with suspicion. A story was spreading through the city's legal circles, the kind whispered only behind closed doors, that federal justice in Chicago was no longer blind. It was for sale. At the center of the scandal stood Judge Leonard Vance, a man who had spent 3 decades building an image of impeccable discipline. He spoke sparingly, smiled rarely, and delivered rulings that seemed carved in granite. Colleagues called him the Wall, a compliment to his consistency. He often told new prosecutors that the law was a sacred trust. Yet, as investigators would soon discover, Vance had been eroding that trust one ruling at a time. It began with a single case, United States v. Mendez Partners, a sprawling financial crime trial involving embezzlement, racketeering, and tax fraud. The evidence was damning: offshore accounts, falsified ledgers, and testimonies from former employees. The defense had little chance of winning, but then something curious happened. The prosecution's key evidence, a set of internal company emails, was suddenly ruled inadmissible. The reasoning seemed thin. Vance cited procedural violations and privacy concerns, but legal experts across the state questioned the logic. The defense won partial dismissal, and within weeks, the accused executives walked free with suspended sentences. It might have ended there, one strange ruling lost among thousands, if not for a young paralegal named Sophia Ramirez. She worked late hours in the clerk's office, processing filings and scheduling hearings. One evening, as she sorted sealed exhibits, she noticed a transaction order attached to an unrelated civil case. It was a routine transfer between a law firm's trust account and a consulting group in the Cayman Islands. The problem was the signature at the bottom, L. Vance. Ramirez hesitated to report it. Judges weren't supposed to appear on any financial documents outside of salary and investments, and she feared for her job. But a few months later, after another controversial verdict favored one of the same law firms, she couldn't ignore the pattern. She quietly contacted the Department of Justice's Internal Investigations Division. The agents who took the call had heard whispers before, but this time they had something tangible. Over the next year, a covert task force mapped out an elaborate web of shell companies and offshore accounts tied to Judge Vance and several high-profile defense attorneys. Millions of dollars have been laundered through entities with names like LVR Consulting and Magistrate Management LLC. Each deposit lined up neatly with dates of favorable rulings, dismissed charges, reduced sentences, overturned convictions. When the story broke, it made national headlines. Federal judge accused of selling verdicts. The news struck at the very core of public trust. For decades, Americans had believed that federal courts stood above corruption. Now, that illusion was crumbling. In court, prosecutors painted a picture of greed masked by professionalism. They traced $2.4 million in payments linked directly to 10 separate rulings. They even found emails, carefully worded, never explicit, but unmistakable in tone. One from a defense lawyer read, "We appreciate your continued understanding in sensitive matters." As always, the agreement stands. Vance's defense claimed entrapment, arguing that the judge had been manipulated by an aggressive sting operation. They presented him as a man suffering from financial strain after his wife's illness and drowning in medical debt. But the evidence was unforgiving. Bank transfers, encrypted phone messages, even travel records showing luxury trips paid for by consulting clients. During sentencing, the lead prosecutor addressed the courtroom. His words echoed across the nation. When a judge's gavel becomes a price tag, the foundation of our democracy cracks. Justice is not a currency. The judge, now stripped of title and power, stood silent as a sentence was read. 28 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the law. His property was seized, his pension revoked, and his name removed from every federal database. In the months that followed, the fallout spread. Past cases he had ruled on were reopened. More than 60 convictions were overturned or retried. Attorneys who had benefited from his rulings faced disbarment. The city that had once celebrated him now whispered his name as a cautionary tale. In interviews years later, Ramirez, the paralegal who exposed him, said she often wondered what might have happened if she'd stayed silent. "He wore that robe like armor," she said. But all it took was one crack to see what was underneath. Judge Leonard Vance now spends his days in a low-security federal facility in Kentucky. Inmates call him Your Honor, sometimes mockingly, sometimes not. He spends hours reading law books, occasionally advising prisoners on appeals. Ironically, he has become a source of legal help to those whose justice he once sold. The scandal changed more than one man's life. It changed how a city viewed its own courts. Every verdict since carries the ghost of Leonard Vance, a reminder that the system built on truth can crumble when its keepers forget what it means to serve it. Number 4. Judge Elaine Porter. When the story of Judge Elaine Porter first reached the newspapers, it was told as a tragedy of misplaced loyalty, a respected jurist undone by her own ambition. But to those who lived through it, the real tragedy belonged to the young woman who exposed her. For years, Judge Porter had been a fixture in the Georgia Judicial Circuit, calm, methodical, and admired for her precision. She was known for her command of complex fraud cases and her ability to keep emotions out of the courtroom. Colleagues called her Steel Magnolia, tough, gracious, and unshakable. Behind the bench, she seemed untouchable. In 2019, she hired a new clerk, 26-year-old Dana Holloway, fresh out of law school and eager to learn. Dana idolized Porter. She stayed late to proofread rulings, fetched coffee during marathon sessions, and watched closely as the judge delivered verdicts with surgical confidence. To Dana, it was a masterclass in justice. Then, one evening in November, she found something that would change everything. While reviewing documents for a property fraud case, Dana noticed two sets of drafts on the judge's desk, identical rulings with very different outcomes. One imposed the maximum penalty. The other dismissed most charges. What caught her attention was a handwritten note on the lenient version. Confirm payment received, JP. At first, she thought it was a joke. But curiosity turned to unease when, a few days later, Porter signed and filed the lenient version. The defendant's company, a construction firm accused of defrauding the city, walked away with a minimal fine. Weeks later, Dana noticed the same pattern in another case, then another. Each time, the defendants were represented by the same law firm, a boutique group known for its political connections. Dana's sense of loyalty warred with her conscience. She had admired Porter for her integrity, but the evidence piling up on her desk told a different story. When she confided in a friend at the district attorney's office, she was urged to document everything quietly. For months, she copied files, emails, and memos, building a secret dossier that mapped out how justice was being sold one ruling at a time. Her discovery reached a turning point in March 2020, when she accidentally overheard a conversation between Porter and a lobbyist in her chambers. Their voices were calm, almost casual, discussing an upcoming case involving a corporate tax evasion charge. Dana froze as she heard Porter say, "If they make the contribution before the hearing, we can revisit the sentence structure." It wasn't a request. It was an agreement. Dana took the recordings and her growing stack of documents to the state's Judicial Oversight Commission. The agents she met there were skeptical. Corruption at Porter's level was almost unthinkable. But within weeks, the evidence spoke for itself. Trace donations, off-the-books transfers, shell organizations routing money through campaign committees. The judge's signature appeared at every intersection. The investigation unfolded quietly at first. Porter continued to preside over trials, unaware that every decision was being scrutinized. But by the time the story leaked to the press, it was too late. Headlines erupted across Georgia. Judge accused of trading rulings for donations. Porter denied everything. Cameras caught her leaving the courthouse, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, insisting that she had been targeted by political enemies. Yet behind the scenes, her carefully built empire was collapsing. Bank records revealed nearly $750,000 in consulting fees from companies tied to the very defendants who had stood before her bench. Dana Holloway's role as whistleblower made her a target. Former colleagues ostracized her. Anonymous messages filled her inbox. Her name became a lightning rod, hero to some, traitor to others. She moved apartments twice after strangers began following her home. Still, she refused to recant her testimony. When the trial opened in 2021, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution's evidence was relentless. Bank transfers, intercepted calls, witnesses from Porter's own chambers. Dana sat quietly in the gallery, watching her mentor reduced to a defendant. When asked by reporters why she'd risked her career, her answer was simple: because the law deserves better than silence. The verdict came after 2 weeks of deliberation. Guilty, racketeering, bribery, and abuse of power. Porter was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. In her final statement, she looked toward Dana and said, "You'll regret this." But Dana didn't flinch. In the years since, Porter's name has become shorthand for betrayal in Georgia's legal community. Dana, meanwhile, left the state and joined a nonprofit specializing in government accountability. She rarely speaks publicly, though in one interview she admitted that the hardest part wasn't exposing her mentor. It was realizing how many people had looked the other way for so long. The story of Judge Elaine Porter isn't just about one woman's corruption. It's about the courage of another who refused to let silence stand in for justice. And in the quiet corridors of the courthouse where it all began, people still whisper her name. Not the judges, but the clerks, as the one who proved that integrity, even in the darkest corners of the law, can still have a voice. Number 5. Justice Harold Benton. For nearly 25 years, Chief Justice Harold Benton was a legend in North Carolina's judicial system. His rulings were cited in law schools, his speeches quoted by politicians, his reputation spotless. He embodied the kind of respect that made ordinary citizens believe in the law again. Calm, principled, incorruptible. Or so it seemed. When his downfall began, it did not start with scandal or rumor. It started with a routine tax audit. In early 2020, federal investigators at the IRS flagged a series of unreported wire transfers moving between a North Carolina business development grant and a series of offshore accounts in the British Virgin Islands. The amounts were modest, $15,000 here, $30,000 there, but what caught their attention was the destination, an account under the name H. Benton Consulting. At first, it looked like a coincidence. The name was common enough. But when agents dug deeper, they found that the account was registered to a post office box that matched one used by the Chief Justice's campaign years earlier. Still, no one wanted to believe it. Benton had built his career on transparency and discipline. He lived in a modest home, drove an aging sedan, and often spoke of his humble upbringing. To accuse him of corruption was to accuse the very soul of the court itself. But the evidence refused to disappear. Investigators traced the first deposit to 2012, a consulting fee from a prominent construction company that had won a lucrative contract after a Supreme Court decision Benton had helped author. From there, the pattern repeated itself. Each time Benton oversaw a ruling favorable to corporate interests, money would quietly appear in one of 3 offshore accounts. By 2019, the total exceeded $1.8 million. The revelation shook everyone who knew him. Former clerks and colleagues insisted it had to be a mistake. Even his detractors admitted he had always seemed above reproach. But beneath that calm exterior, Benton had cultivated something few had ever suspected, a network of powerful businessmen and lobbyists who viewed his court as an investment. When the news broke, it was buried under polite headlines. Chief Justice faces inquiry over financial discrepancies. But within days, the full truth emerged. A whistleblower from the state treasury leaked documents confirming that the accounts were active and maintained under false identification. The FBI descended quietly, their investigation cloaked in secrecy to avoid destabilizing the state's highest court. They combed through decades of rulings, campaign donations, and financial records. It was a forensic maze, but every trail led to Benton's signature. The defining moment came when agents subpoenaed his private correspondence. Hidden among personal files was a series of encrypted emails with the subject line client confirmation. The tone was businesslike, the contents damning. Benton had personally negotiated payments in exchange for rulings favorable to corporate clients, disguising them as policy consulting agreements. When confronted, Benton's composure finally cracked. "You think you understand justice?" he reportedly told the agents. "Justice is compromise. You can't build it without leverage." The trial was unlike anything North Carolina had ever seen. For months, the courtroom became a theater of moral collapse. Prosecutors presented evidence that read like a ledger of betrayal. Account statements, email trails, and testimonies from executives who admitted to participating in the scheme. Benton's defense argued that he had merely provided legal insight after rulings were made, insisting there was no quid pro quo. But as one prosecutor put it, when a judge profits from a verdict, the verdict itself is a crime. The public reaction was visceral. Citizens who had once looked to Benton as a moral compass now demanded his resignation. Protesters filled the courthouse steps, chanting, "No justice without honesty." For younger judges and attorneys, it was like watching the collapse of a monument. During sentencing, Benton remained stoic. His words, when he finally spoke, were cold and detached. "You wanted a perfect judge. I was never that man." He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison and ordered to repay the $1.8 million. The accounts were seized, his assets liquidated. The state's Supreme Court issued an apology to the public, acknowledging the unprecedented breach of judicial integrity. But Benton's legacy could not be undone. Dozens of rulings connected to his tenure were challenged, creating years of legal uncertainty. The decisions of his court, once a symbol of order, now carried the stain of corruption. In prison, Benton refused interviews. He reportedly spends his days in silence, keeping to himself in the law library. Former colleagues say he still reads every new Supreme Court decision, marking them with notes as if still on the bench. In his absence, the courthouse replaced his portrait with a small plaque bearing a quote from an unknown author. Power reveals the man beneath the robe. To this day, the phrase Benton money is used among lawyers in North Carolina as shorthand for judicial corruption, a reminder that even the highest seat in justice can be bought when conscience runs empty. Number 6. Judges Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan. For years, the Juvenile Court of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, was considered one of the most efficient in America. Cases moved swiftly, sentences were firm, and the community praised its judges for keeping troubled teens off the streets. Parents were told their children were being taught discipline. Politicians praised the court's zero-tolerance policies. But behind that efficiency was one of the darkest judicial scandals in modern U.S. history. A story so grotesque, it would become known as Kids for Cash. The architects of this corruption were judges Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan, two men whose names had once been synonymous with integrity. They were close friends, longtime colleagues, and public figures who frequently lectured about morality and family values. Ciavarella was stern but charming, a man who loved cameras and community praise. Conahan was quieter, preferring the shadows where deals were made. Together, they controlled every corner of the Luzerne County Courthouse. The scheme began in 2003 when a private developer approached them with a lucrative proposal to close the county's aging juvenile detention center and replace it with a privately operated facility. The project promised profit, jobs, and efficiency, or so it seemed. But what few knew was that both judges had secretly invested in the project. In return for ensuring that the new center stayed full, they would receive massive kickbacks. From that moment, justice in Luzerne County became a business. For 5 years, thousands of minors, many charged with petty offenses, were funneled into the private facility. Some were as young as 12. Their crimes were often trivial: school fights, vandalism, skipping class. Yet sentences were harsh and immediate, often without lawyers or due process. Parents watched in horror as their children were handcuffed and taken away within minutes of standing before the bench. To the public, it looked like discipline. To the judges, it was revenue. Each filled bed meant another payout. By 2008, whispers began to reach the media. A few defense attorneys questioned why so many first-time offenders were being locked up. Then came the parents, dozens of them, banding together to demand answers. The breaking point arrived when the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia uncovered a staggering pattern. More than 6,000 children sentenced in violation of basic constitutional rights. The FBI took notice. Quietly, agents began tracking financial records, tracing payments from the private detention company to shell corporations controlled by the judges. The numbers were shocking. Over $2.6 million in kickbacks, disguised as finder's fees and consulting agreements. When a story finally broke, it ignited national outrage. Headlines blared, "Judges sold kids for cash." Television cameras swarmed the courthouse. The two men who had once embodied order now symbolized moral collapse. At trial, prosecutors laid out the mechanics of the scheme in chilling detail. Conahan had arranged contracts ensuring the private facility would receive county funding. Ciavarella, meanwhile, delivered the supply, a steady stream of children whose only real crime was crossing paths with the wrong courtroom. One mother testified that her 14-year-old daughter had been sentenced to 18 months for creating a parody MySpace page mocking her principal. Another boy, just 13, spent nearly a year behind bars for stealing a CD. The judges sat motionless as parents wept before them. When Ciavarella took the stand, He insisted that the payments were finder's fees, not bribes. He claimed his harsh sentencing style had nothing to do with the money. But his calm facade cracked when prosecutors read aloud one of his own emails, referring to the detention center as our business. The verdict was swift. Both men were found guilty of racketeering, fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Ciavarella was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Conahan received 17. The courtroom that had once echoed with their authority was silent as the gavel fell. Parents who had spent years fighting for justice embraced one another, their tears mingling with relief and grief. One mother whispered, "They stole our children." The aftermath was devastating. Thousands of juvenile records had to be expunged. The state paid millions in settlements. And the community of Luzerne County, once proud of its strict judges, was left questioning how easily justice could be twisted into commerce. In a rare interview years later, one of the FBI agents who led the investigation said they wore the robes of justice, but underneath, they were businessmen. Today, the courthouse has changed. Mandatory representation for juveniles is now law. Oversight committees have been established. Yet the ghosts of those years remain. In the eyes of the children who lost their youth, in the parents who still can't forget the day their kids were taken. Judge Ciavarella is scheduled for release in 2035. He will be an old man by then, living out the remainder of his life in a country that will never forgive him. Conahan, weakened by illness, was released early in 2020. He died quietly at home, never facing the full fury of the people he betrayed. The Kids for Cash scandal remains one of the clearest examples of how power, when unchecked, can corrupt not just a system, but the very idea of justice itself. Number 7. Judge Thomas Rayburn. In Texas, justice often wore a cowboy's hat, confident, tough, and unyielding. Judge Thomas Rayburn fit the image perfectly. A former prosecutor turned district judge, he was known for his booming voice, sharp gavel, and fierce stance on violent crime. The press loved him. The public admired him. Tough but fair, they said. But beneath that stern devotion to law and order was a man running from his own corruption, one ruling at a time. For most of his 20-year career, Rayburn presided over some of the state's most gruesome criminal cases: murders, assaults, organized crime. He relished his reputation as the judge who never flinched. His courtroom was his kingdom, and his word carried the weight of the law. But behind the veneer of righteousness was a secret that would unravel everything he had built. It began in 2017 with a case that would come to define his downfall: State versus Pritchard, the trial of a wealthy rancher accused of killing a drifter on his land. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses placed Pritchard at the scene, DNA matched. Even his own employees hinted at a violent temper. A guilty verdict seemed inevitable. But somehow, in a twist that shocked prosecutors, Pritchard walked free after Rayburn declared a mistrial based on procedural inconsistencies. Reporters smelled blood. Something about the ruling didn't fit. The defense had been sloppy, unprepared, and clearly losing ground. Yet the judge's sudden intervention had derailed the case completely. Within weeks, whispers began. Pritchard's family had quietly donated to a judicial ethics committee, one chaired by Rayburn himself. The rumors reached federal investigators after a second case involving another wealthy defendant ended in similar fashion. Each time, the ruling favored someone with deep pockets. Each time, money had moved, never directly, always through shell donations to foundations and PACs linked to the judge's allies. Behind closed doors, Rayburn's world was crumbling. Years earlier, he had invested heavily in a failing land development project in West Texas. The venture collapsed, leaving him millions in debt. Desperate to save face, he began leveraging his position, taking contributions from businessmen and attorneys with cases before his bench. The payments were disguised as consulting retainers, often delivered through intermediaries. It was an old story dressed in new suits, greed disguised as necessity. The FBI began digging quietly. What they found was staggering: a web of secret accounts, offshore transfers, and bribes disguised as political donations. Rayburn had accepted more than $900,000 in exchange for favorable rulings, contracts, and sentencing leniency. Still, what brought him down wasn't the money. It was a recording. A defense attorney, fearing he was being double-crossed, had recorded a conversation in which Rayburn assured him that a key witness's testimony would not hold weight if the agreement was honored. When the tape reached federal prosecutors, it became the nail in his coffin. The arrest was dramatic. Early one morning, agents surrounded Rayburn's home just outside Dallas. The man who had once sent hundreds to prison now stood in his front yard in handcuffs, his robe still hanging on the back of his chair inside. At trial, he tried to appear composed, the old fire flickering behind his eyes. But the evidence crushed him: financial records, emails, testimony from lawyers who admitted to paying him. His defense centered on one desperate argument: that the payments were gifts from friends, tokens of gratitude. The jury didn't buy it. As the verdict was read, he sat motionless. Guilty: bribery, extortion, and abuse of office. The same words he had once spoken to others now sealed his fate. He was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison. The judge who delivered his sentence, one of his former colleagues, paused before speaking. "You wore the robe," she said, "but you forgot the weight of it." The aftermath rippled across Texas. Past convictions under Rayburn were re-examined. Appeals flooded the system, and his courtroom, once a place of authority, became a crime scene. Reporters who had once praised his tough on crime rulings now used his name as a synonym for hypocrisy. From prison, Rayburn wrote a letter to a local newspaper claiming he had been targeted for political reasons. "They wanted to make an example of me," he wrote. "I was no worse than anyone else." The letter only deepened public disgust. Years later, one of the prosecutors who had faced him in court reflected on his legacy. "He believed the law was his to command," she said. "But justice doesn't bend, not even for the man holding the gavel." Rayburn's story remains a haunting chapter in Texas judicial history, a reminder that the law can be betrayed not by ignorance or weakness, but by the arrogance of believing one stands above it. Case 8. Judge Norman Fletcher. In the flat, windswept plains of Kansas, the town of Wexler prided itself on being the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and trust wasn't something you questioned. It was simply assumed. At the heart of that trust stood Judge Norman Fletcher, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and gentle manners. He'd spent 20 years on the bench, the sort of judge who sent thank-you notes to jurors and remembered clerks' birthdays. He was, by all appearances, the embodiment of small-town decency. But beneath the friendly facade was a quiet economy of favors, a shadow system where verdicts, fines, and even probation decisions were negotiated not in the courtroom, but in the hushed corners of local diners and back offices. The scandal began with something small: an envelope. In 2019, a local reporter named Jenna Mills was covering a minor embezzlement case involving a city contractor. She noticed something strange. The defendant, despite clear evidence of guilt, received only community service and a suspended fine. When she asked the clerk how it happened, the woman whispered a phrase that stuck with her: "He took care of the envelope." Curious, Jenna started digging. Over the next several months, she noticed a pattern. Defendants with certain attorneys, those connected to a handful of local business owners, consistently received lighter sentences. She requested court records, interviewed former staff, and discovered a paper trail of irregularities: missing fine receipts, inexplicable adjustments, and sealed payment logs. Then one day, a photo arrived in her inbox. It was grainy, taken from a restaurant across the street from the courthouse. It showed Judge Fletcher at lunch with one of the town's most prominent defense lawyers, a man who happened to represent half of the defendants who'd benefited from those adjustments. Between them, on the table, was a plain brown envelope. That image, quiet, almost banal, would end up exposing a corruption network that had operated undetected for years. When federal investigators joined the case, they found the simplicity of the scheme almost astonishing. Fletcher never asked for bribes directly. Instead, attorneys who wanted favorable rulings would make charitable contributions, to a fund called the Wexler Legal Education Foundation, a nonprofit founded by the judge himself, supposedly to sponsor scholarships for law students. In reality, the fund existed almost entirely on paper. Nearly every donation was withdrawn in cash within days of being received. When investigators subpoenaed the foundation's records, they found only a single notebook, Fletcher's handwriting, listing donors and arrangements next to initials of defendants. Over the years, the scheme had funneled more than $400,000 in cash through that foundation. In return, Fletcher had reduced sentences, dismissed cases, and influenced juries through subtle courtroom guidance. The system worked in silence, an unspoken understanding between attorneys and the man behind the bench. When news of the investigation leaked, the town of Wexler was stunned. Many refused to believe it. Fletcher had officiated weddings, coached Little League, and donated to every local church fundraiser. But when FBI agents searched his home, they found $120,000 in envelopes hidden in old law books, each labeled with a date and a defendant's initials. During interrogation, Fletcher insisted the money was donations he hadn't yet processed. The agents didn't need to press further. The evidence spoke louder than his denial. The trial was both heartbreaking and surreal. Dozens of townspeople attended, many of them crying as they watched the man who had once symbolized fairness stand accused of betrayal. His defense team painted him as a kindly old man caught in bureaucratic confusion, arguing that the foundation's paperwork had been mishandled. But the prosecutors were ruthless. They presented testimony from attorneys who admitted, some tearfully, to slipping envelopes under his office door, knowing exactly what they were buying. When a guilty verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Fletcher's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water. He looked out at the rows of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even his church pastor, all watching as the mask he'd worn for decades fell away. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for bribery, fraud, and tax evasion. After his sentencing, Jenna Mills, the reporter who first exposed him, published a short editorial. It read, "He didn't need the money. He wanted the power." The envelope was never about cash. It was about control. Her words echoed across the state, printed in newspapers from Topeka to Wichita. In the years since, Wexler's courthouse has been repainted, its walls stripped of Fletcher's portrait. The foundation was dissolved, its remaining funds transferred to real scholarships. But for the people of Wexler, trust no longer comes easily. Every verdict now carries the faint weight of doubt. And though Judge Fletcher fades quietly in a cell hundreds of miles away, his shadow still lingers in that small Kansas town. A reminder that even the gentlest hands can twist justice when no one is watching. Number 9. Judge Robert Marchetti Dash. In New York City, corruption is not an unfamiliar word, but when it infects the very heart of justice, it shakes the city to its core. Judge Robert Bobby Marchetti was once one of Manhattan's brightest legal stars, a man who had risen from the crowded tenements of Brooklyn to the polished mahogany chambers of the state Supreme Court. His story was the kind journalists love to tell, a self-made hero of the law, proof that integrity could thrive even in a city known for its compromises. But by 2022, the hero had fallen. Marchetti's career began in the 1990s as a tough but fair prosecutor. His courtroom demeanor was magnetic, sharp, articulate, fearless. He spoke of justice as if it were a religion. When he took the bench in 2008, he became known for his impassioned speeches to convicted defendants. "The law gives you choices," he'd say. "I hope this sentence teaches you to make the right ones." Yet while he was lecturing others about morality, his own choices were slowly rotting beneath the surface. It started innocently, or so he claimed later. After years on the bench, Marchetti had developed close relationships with several prominent real estate developers and political donors. They invited him to fundraisers, golf retreats, and charity events. The judge enjoyed the attention. To him, these were perks of respect, not warnings. But those friendships came with expectations. One developer, Marcus DeLuca, owned several construction companies that were repeatedly cited for safety violations and worker fatalities. His cases often found their way to Marchetti's courtroom. Over time, the fines grew lighter, the rulings softer. The judge, once known for his moral rigor, began bending in subtle ways, postponing hearings, reducing penalties, dismissing charges for lack of evidence. By 2020, investigative journalists of the City Ledger noticed something strange. Of the 27 cases involving DeLuca's companies over 5 years, every single one had been handled by Judge Marchetti, an improbable coincidence. More curious still, the judge's personal financial disclosures showed a pattern of consulting income from an obscure real estate advisory firm called Urban Integrity Group. When reporters traced the company, it led straight to a P.O. box registered by DeLuca's lawyer. It was the perfect setup, discreet, legal on paper, and buried beneath bureaucratic language. But the FBI was already watching. Agents uncovered more than $1.3 million in payments funneled through shell entities. Each payment coincided with a favorable ruling or contract dispute settled in DeLuca's favor. Marchetti's consulting work was nothing more than a paper trail designed to sanitize the bribes. The moment of reckoning came during a wiretap. DeLuca, unaware his phone was tapped, was recorded bragging at a dinner meeting. "Bobby's on the payroll. That gavel's worth every penny." The recording spread through the Justice Department like wildfire. Within weeks, a grand jury had convened. When federal agents arrived at his penthouse, Marchetti didn't fight. He opened the door, asked to put on his suit jacket, and walked out calmly, as though heading to court. Cameras caught him adjusting his tie, still trying to look like the man who had once defined authority. The trial that followed was surreal, a judge tried before the very system he had once ruled. The courtroom was packed with reporters, attorneys, and former colleagues. The prosecution's case was devastating. Wire transfers, emails, text messages, and DeLuca's own testimony. Facing overwhelming evidence, Marchetti made a fateful decision. He took the stand. In his testimony, he claimed he had been pressured by powerful people, that the money had never influenced his rulings. "I believe that was helping the city," he said. "They told me these developments would create jobs, housing, opportunity. I thought I was doing good." The words fell flat. The prosecutor's response was surgical. "You were doing good for yourself," she said, holding up a photo of his $300,000 sports car. "The people you sentenced for theft stole less than you did." The jury took less than 2 days to deliver its verdict. Guilty on all 27 counts of bribery, racketeering, and conspiracy. When the sentence was read, 32 years in federal prison, Marchetti closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath. Some said it was a prayer. Others thought it was a curse. The fall of Judge Marchetti became one of the most widely covered judicial scandals in New York's history. His name joined a list of disgraced public officials, but his case cut deeper because of who he had been, the symbol of self-made virtue. In the years since, his former courtroom has become almost legendary among young lawyers. They call it the silent bench. No judge sits there for long. Some say it's superstition. Others say it's guilt. As for Marchetti, he now occupies a small cell in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York, where he teaches inmates about constitutional rights, the same rights he once sold to the highest bidder. His story reminds the city that even the most eloquent voices of justice can be drowned by greed. And when the gavel falls on the guilty, sometimes it lands hardest on those who once held it. Number 10. Judge Samuel Whitaker Dash. It was the trial that stopped a nation, a moment when the American justice system was forced to look in the mirror and confront its own reflection. The man at the center of it all was federal appellate Judge Samuel Whitaker, a figure once so respected that his opinions had shaped national law for decades. He had lectured at Harvard, advised presidents, and written essays about the sanctity of judicial independence. To generations of young attorneys, he was justice personified. But behind the marble pillars and the press conferences, Whitaker was hiding a secret that would unravel everything he had built. A truth so corrosive it would expose not just his corruption, but the fragility of the system he once defended. It began with a whistleblower. In 2023, A paralegal at the U.S. Court of Appeals noticed something strange in the judge's travel reimbursements. A series of educational symposiums he claimed to attend overseas appeared to overlap with private meetings hosted by lobbying groups and foreign corporate representatives. When she flagged it to her supervisor, she was told to leave it alone. "He's above your pay grade," they said. But the paralegal didn't stop. She took her findings to a journalist. The Washington Sentinel published the story, Judge Whitaker's Secret Trips, Who's Paying for Justice? The initial scandal seemed small, a question of ethics and expenses. But the deeper investigators dug, the darker it became. Federal prosecutors uncovered that Whitaker had been accepting luxury accommodations, flights, and honoraria from a powerful network of corporate lobbyists whose cases regularly appeared before his court. In exchange, he allegedly influenced appellate decisions, quietly ensuring rulings favored certain industries: energy, pharmaceuticals, defense. The paper trail stretched across continents. Swiss accounts, offshore transfers, and a consulting firm run by Whitaker's former clerk, now acting as a go-between for corporate interests. The total in illicit benefits exceeded $3.5 million. When agents arrived at Whitaker's Virginia home with a warrant, they found exactly what they expected: ledgers, encrypted hard drives, and one small, locked safe. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. In it, the judge had recorded every trip, every meeting, every payment. At the bottom of each page, one word repeated: balanced. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. Whitaker's arrest sent shockwaves through Washington. Never before had a sitting federal appellate judge faced charges of this magnitude. His colleagues issued statements of disbelief and sadness. Legal commentators called it the darkest day in modern judicial history. For the public, already jaded by corruption, this case hit differently. This was not a small-town judge or a rogue state official. This was the federal judiciary, the supposed pinnacle of impartiality. During his trial, Whitaker appeared calm, his silver hair neatly combed, his tone almost professorial. He didn't deny taking the trips or the money. Instead, he argued that he had been conducting private diplomacy, cultivating relationships that benefited national stability. The defense claimed he had used his influence for soft power to strengthen America's image abroad. The prosecutor's response was brutal. He wasn't serving his country, she said. He was selling its justice system to the highest bidder. The trial lasted nearly 3 months. Witnesses included former aides, corporate executives, and even foreign officials. The evidence was overwhelming: coded emails, bank transfers, testimony from insiders. At one point, a juror reportedly wept as an FBI agent described the scale of Whitaker's deception. When a verdict came, it was unanimous: guilty on all counts: bribery, fraud, and conspiracy against the United States. The sentence: 40 years in federal prison. Reporters later described the moment he heard his punishment. Whitaker didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses, nodded once, and said, "So this is justice." Those words became the headline that defined the scandal. In the years since, the case has come to symbolize the vulnerability of even the highest courts. Law schools still dissect it as a cautionary tale, proof that no institution, no matter how sacred, is immune to corruption. The federal judiciary underwent sweeping reforms, tightening oversight and ethics disclosure rules. But trust, once broken, has never fully returned. The paralegal who exposed him disappeared from public life. She declined all interviews, saying only in a brief statement, "I didn't destroy justice. I just revealed what it had become." As for Whitaker, he now occupies a small room in a high-security federal facility. He spends his days reading philosophy and writing essays no one publishes. In one, leaked years later, he wrote, "We never judge ourselves guilty until someone else holds the gavel." His words, perhaps unintentionally, spoke for every name on this list. Men and women who stood at the altar of justice only to desecrate it. Because when justice itself stands accused, the verdict belongs not to a courtroom, but to history.